There was one face I would commonly see when I was a legal journalist covering major trials for the Chicago Tribune. His name was Dr. Robert J. Stein, the medical examiner of Cook County, Illinois, who would testify about the autopsies he would perform in homicide cases. In all, he conducted 20,000 autopsies, in each case determining the manner of death and the cause of death for the victim. Now, for Jesus of Nazareth, the manner of death is indisputable. He died from the effects of crucifixion, a humiliating, painful method of execution so brutal that they had to invent a new word to describe it: excruciating, which literally means out of the cross. Cicero called it a cruel and disgusting punishment, adding that the very mention of the cross should be far removed not only from a Roman citizen's body, but from his mind, his eyes, his ears. Crucifixion was brutally efficient. There is no record of anyone ever surviving a full Roman crucifixion. Now, Josephus, the first century Jewish historian who worked for the Romans, did write about one incident where someone survived a partial crucifixion. He said, "I saw many captives crucified and remembered 3 of them as my former acquaintance. I was very sorry at this in my mind and went with tears in my eyes to Titus and told him of them. So he immediately commanded them to be taken down and to have the greatest care taken of them in order to their recovery. Yet 2 of them died under the physician's hands, while the 3rd recovered." But what actually killed the unfortunate victims of crucifixion? In other words, what would Dr. Stein list as the cause of death on their death certificates? Well, we'll examine that in this session as we continue to look at the first of 4 E words that summarize the evidence for the resurrection. As you might recall, this E stands for execution. That Jesus was a victim of crucifixion is such a well-established historical fact that you would get laughed out of a major academic institution if you claimed, well, no, Jesus really wasn't crucified. Why? Because much of what we know about the ancient world comes to us from 1 or maybe 2 sources. But for Jesus' crucifixion, we not only have multiple early first century accounts in the New Testament, but we've also got 5 ancient sources outside the Bible. We have Josephus, the first century Jewish historian who worked for the Romans, Tacitus, another early historian, Lucian, Mirabar Serapion, and even the Jewish Talmud agrees that he was crucified. Jesus would have been nailed to the cross with spikes like this one. This is a reproduction of the size and weight and sharpness of the kind of spikes that Romans commonly used in crucifixion. They would have been driven through his ankle bones and also through his wrists. Now, I know most paintings show that the spikes go through his palms, but his weight would have caused the skin to tear and he would have fallen off the cross. And in the language of the day, the wrist was considered part of the hand. Now, the nail would have crushed the median nerve, which runs out to the hand. The pain would have been like taking a pair of pliers and squeezing your funny bone. The spikes fulfill the prophecy in Psalm 22, verse 16, which says, "They pierced my hands and feet," which incidentally was written some 1,000 years before the time of Christ and centuries before Rome even began to use crucifixion as a method of execution. Well, once hoisted on the cross, Jesus' shoulders would have been dislocated. This fulfills Psalm 22, verse 14, which says, "All my bones were out of joint." By the way, Jesus specifically applied Psalm 22 to himself when he cried out its opening words on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" So, what's the cause of death in crucifixion? Well, several things can contribute to death, including the great loss of blood, but the primary cause of death is asphyxiation. As the crucifixion expert, Dr. Alexander Metherell, described to me, hanging in that vertical position puts stress on the chest muscles and diaphragm and locks the lungs into the inhale position. In order to exhale, the victim must push up with his feet so the tension on the muscles would be eased for the moment. This meant scraping his bloodied back against the coarse wood of the cross. After then managing to exhale, he would then be able to relax down and take in another breath. And he'd repeat this process up and down until exhaustion took over and he wouldn't be able to breathe anymore. He would go into respiratory acidosis, where the carbon dioxide in the blood is dissolved as carbonic acid, causing the acidity of the blood to rise. This would lead to an irregular heartbeat, and with his heart beating erratically, Jesus would have known that he was at the moment of death, which is when he would have been able to say, "Lord, into your hands I commit my spirit." And then he died of cardiac arrest. Metherell added one other important detail. The torture of the cross would have resulted in the collection of fluid in the membrane around the heart, called the pericardial effusion, as well as around the lung, which is called a pleural effusion. When the Roman soldier wanted to confirm that Jesus was dead, he thrust a spear that apparently went through the right lung and into the heart. When the spear was yanked out, some fluid, the effusions, came out with the appearance of a clear fluid along with blood. And although John probably didn't understand what he was describing, this is corroborated in John 19, verse 34, which says, "One of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water." Friends, there is no question that Jesus was dead when he was taken off the cross. You can't fake the inability to breathe for very long. Besides, the spear in the heart would have settled the matter. Furthermore, the Roman soldiers weren't about to allow someone to survive a crucifixion. If they did, they themselves would have faced execution. And one more point. If Jesus did manage to survive, think of the horrible physical condition he would have been in. He never would have inspired the disciples to go out and risk their own lives by proclaiming that this pathetic figure was the Lord of life who triumphed over the grave. They wouldn't have been motivated to start a worldwide movement on the glorious promise that someday we would survive death as Jesus had. Instead, they would have called an ambulance. No, Jesus was dead. Even the prestigious, peer-reviewed, secular Journal of the American Medical Association published an analysis of Jesus' crucifixion and concluded, quote, "Clearly, the weight of the historical and medical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead even before the wound to his side was inflicted." Now, if you don't believe that, we can go to one of the most liberal New Testament scholars, John Dominic Crossan, who said, "Jesus' death by execution under Pontius Pilate is as sure as anything historical can ever be." And if you don't believe him, we can go to an agnostic New Testament scholar like James Tabor, who said, quote, "I think we need have no doubt that given Jesus' execution by Roman crucifixion, that he was truly dead." And if you don't believe him, we can go to an atheist New Testament scholar, Gerd Ludemann, who will tell you, quote, "Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable." Now, I don't know how much you studied ancient history, but there are very few facts of ancient history that a critical, skeptical, atheist historian like Gerd Ludemann will say are indisputable. One of them is the death of Jesus by crucifixion, So the first E is for execution. Jesus was dead. The second E stands for the word early. We have early reports or early accounts that Jesus rose from the dead. In other words, reports that came virtually immediately after his death. Why is that important? Because I used to think, like a lot of skeptics, that the idea of the resurrection was a legend. And I knew it took time for legends to develop in the ancient world, so I figured 100, 150, 200 years after the life of Jesus, legends were spawned, mythologies were spun, stories were invented, including the claim that he rose from the dead. But what I learned decimated the idea that the resurrection is a legend. Follow me on this. I think this is fascinating. We have preserved for us a creed of the earliest church, a statement of conviction that the first Christians rallied around based on facts that they knew to be true. Now, this creed contains the essence of Christianity. It says Jesus died. Why? For our sins. He was buried. He rose on the third day. And it mentions then specific individuals and groups to whom he appeared. Now, what's important about this creed is how immediately it developed after Jesus' death. Too early to explain it away by saying it's a legend. My friend, Dr. Gary Habermas, a leading resurrection scholar, came up with the timeline of this creed. We start with a letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to the church in Corinth about 22 to 25 years after Jesus' death. We call it 1 Corinthians. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, starting at verse 3, we find this creed. Here's what Paul wrote. For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance. So let's pause there. This is technical rabbinic language in which Paul is saying, in essence, I received this sacred material from reliable sources, and I don't want to change anything. I simply want to turn around and pass it on to you because it's so important. Now, notice too that he uses the past tense. He says, I gave the Corinthians this creed on an earlier visit. So what is the creed? Paul goes on. That Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, that's Peter, and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also as to one abnormally born. Now, notice how this mentions that there were at least 500 witnesses, most of whom are still living, though others have died. Now, in a sense, Paul is saying, hey, look, if you don't believe me, go ask these eyewitnesses. They're still around. They'll confirm the story. Now, you don't issue a challenge like that unless you're certain they're going to back you up. Now, here's the thing. If Paul wrote this letter 22 to 25 years after Jesus' death, and he had already given the creed earlier to the church in Corinth, this means we can date it to about 20 years after Jesus' death. Now, let's stop there. Historically speaking, that is very impressive, especially when you consider that the first two biographies of Alexander the Great, written by Arrian and Plutarch, were written 400 years after his life, and they're generally considered reliable. So within 20 years, that's very quick on the historical scale. But we can go back even earlier than that. How? Because we know that Paul used to be Saul of Tarsus, a hater and persecutor of Christians. About 1 to 3 years after the death of Jesus, Saul was on the road to Damascus when, bam, he has this encounter with the risen Christ and he becomes the Apostle Paul. Immediately, he goes into Damascus and he meets with some apostles. Now, many scholars believe that they're the ones who gave him this creed about the resurrection, which he then later writes in the letter to the church in Corinth. But other scholars say, well, Maybe he received this creed 3 years later when he went to Jerusalem and he met for 15 days with 2 eyewitnesses to the resurrection who are specifically mentioned in the creed, Peter and James. Paul described that meeting in Galatians, where in Galatians 1 verse 18, he uses the Greek word hysterio, which suggests that this was an investigative meeting. They're checking each other out. What did you see? What did you experience? Many scholars believe it was during this meeting that Paul was given this creed by 2 people cited in the creed itself. But either way, this means he was given the creed within 1 to 6 years after Jesus' death, and therefore the beliefs that make up that creed go back even earlier, virtually to the cross itself. So there's no big time gap between the death of Jesus and the later development of a legend that he rose from the dead. Here we have the equivalent of a news flash from ancient history. In fact, one of the most prominent scholars in this area, Dr. James D.G. Dunn, said this tradition, by which he means this creed, this tradition, we can be entirely confident, was formulated as tradition within months of Jesus' death. Within months. Now, this is especially important when we consider that one of the greatest classical historians who ever lived, A.N. Sherwin White of Oxford, studied the rate at which legend developed in the ancient world. And he said the passage of 2 generations of time is not even enough for legend to grow up and wipe out a solid core of historical truth. But we don't have any generations passing here. We've got a news flash that goes right back to the beginning. Friends, this is historical gold. Historians drool over stuff like this. And that's not the only early report we have about the resurrection. We have others in Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, the book of Acts, and Paul's epistles, all of which date back so early that they were circulating during the lifetimes of Jesus' contemporaries, who would have been all too happy to point out the errors if they were making this stuff up. Friends, we have an execution. Jesus was dead. Then we have early reports that he rose from the dead, accounts so immediate that you can't dismiss them as being legend. But that's not all we have. We have 2 more words that begin with the letter E and which complete our case for Easter. We'll cover those in our next session, so stay tuned. All through history, the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus has convinced skeptics that he is who he claimed to be, the unique Son of God. One example is James, the half-brother of Jesus. Now, we know from the Gospels that Jesus had 4 half-brothers, James, Judas, Joseph, and Simon, as well as some half-sisters whose names aren't recorded. And we also know that James was not a follower of Jesus during Jesus' lifetime. However, this creed in 1 Corinthians 15 tells us that the risen Christ appeared to James. He sees the evidence for the resurrection with his own eyes. And so what happens to James? He doesn't just become a Christian, but he becomes a leader of the church in Jerusalem and is later martyred for his faith in Jesus, the resurrected Son of God. Asked one scholar, what would it take to convince you that your brother is the Lord? Really, the only thing that could account for that would be what's reported in the early creed, that the crucified Jesus appeared alive to James. Friends, that's the power of the resurrection to change a life and to change an eternity. According to the Guinness Book of World Records, he was the most successful lawyer who ever lived. As a defense attorney, he won 245 murder trials in a row, either before the jury or on appeal. He was knighted twice by Queen Elizabeth and became a justice on the highest court of his land. And even though he had grown up in a nominal Christian home, Sir Lionel Luckhoo was skeptical about whether Jesus really did rise from the dead. But then he decided to take his monumental legal skill and apply it to the historical data for the resurrection so he could come up with a definitive verdict in the case for Easter. Well, if anyone knew what constitutes reliable evidence, it was Sir Lionel. He knew how to spot every possible loophole. He knew how to test facts to see whether they withstood scrutiny. In short, he was not the kind of person who could easily have the wool pulled over his eyes. Well, after thoroughly investigating the resurrection from a legal perspective, Sir Lionel finally reached his conclusion, which he summarized in one sentence. He said, quote, "I say unequivocally that the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ is so overwhelming that it compels acceptance by proof, which leaves absolutely no room for doubt." This from the most successful attorney who ever lived. As I've been saying, the case for Easter is powerful and persuasive. The famous professor of history at Oxford University, Thomas Arnold, put it this way. He said, "I know of no one fact in the history of mankind which is proven by better evidence of every sort to the understanding of a fair inquirer than the great sign which God has given us that Christ died and rose from the dead." Well, so far, we've considered two of the 4 E words that summarize evidence for the resurrection. The first E is for execution, and we've seen that Jesus' death by crucifixion is historically indisputable, to quote a noted atheist historian. The second E stands for early, and we've seen how the early accounts of the resurrection come so immediately after Jesus' death that they can't be dismissed as mere legend. But that's not all we have. Now we'll consider the third E, which stands for empty. We have an empty tomb. The historical record tells us that after Jesus' death, his body was buried in a tomb belonging to Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Jewish council. The tomb was sealed, and Matthew tells us it was guarded, and yet it was discovered empty on that first Easter morning. Now, some skeptics say that the real reason the tomb was empty was because the body was never in it in the first place. The agnostic New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman wrote a book called How Jesus Became God, in which he cast doubt about whether the body of Jesus was really entombed. While he said he can't definitively say that the burial reports about Jesus are false, he said this: if the Romans followed their normal policies and customs, and if Pilate was the man whom all our sources indicate he was, then it is highly unlikely that Jesus was decently buried on the day of his execution in a tomb that anyone could later identify. Well, that would certainly explain why the tomb was empty, but is he correct? Actually, several scholars, including Craig A. Evans, who has authored 50 books and lectured at Oxford, Cambridge, and Yale universities, wrote their own book to rebut Ehrman. They call theirs How God Became Jesus. And in it, Evans makes the convincing case that the gospel accounts describing Jesus' removal from the cross and burial are consistent with archaeological evidence and with Jewish law. He added that it's simply erroneous to assert that the Romans didn't permit the burial of the executed including the crucified. To support that contention, he quotes from a summary of Roman practice and procedure from that era, known as the Digesta, which says this, quote, "The bodies of those who are condemned to death should not be refused their relatives." And the divine Augustus, in the 10th book of his life, said that this rule had been observed. At present, the bodies of those who have been punished are only buried when this has been requested and permission granted. And sometimes it is not permitted, especially where persons have been convicted of high treason. Even the bodies of those who have been sentenced to be burned can be claimed, in order that their bones and ashes, after having been collected, may be buried. The bodies of persons who have been punished should be given to whoever requests them for the purpose of burial. Besides, we have archaeological evidence that crucifixion victims were buried. In 1968, the remains of a buried crucifixion victim from the 1st century were unearthed with a 7-inch spike driven through the heel bone and a bit of olive wood from the cross still attached. Then, in 2018, research was published about a second crucifixion victim. This one had been unearthed from the ground rather than a tomb in 2007. He had been in his early 30s and below average height. His arms appeared to have been tied to the cross by a rope, which was a technique that the Romans sometimes used, and medical examiners found a lesion and unhealed fracture in one of the heel bones, suggesting that his feet had been nailed. In fact, the lesion passed through the entire right heel bone. So there is archaeological confirmation that indeed crucifixion victims were allowed to be buried. In fact, scores of nails bearing calcium from human bones have been discovered in tombs from that area. Said Dr. Craig, quote, "I conclude that the burial of the body of Jesus in a known tomb, according to Jewish law and custom, is highly probable, and that it was the knowledge of the tomb and the discovery that it was empty, in addition to the appearances of Jesus, that led the followers of Jesus to speak in terms of resurrection." Craig also disputed the contention that Pontius Pilate was such a ruthless and brutal leader that he would have refused to allow anyone to take Jesus' body for burial. On the contrary, said Craig, it would have been in Pilate's best interest to act as the gospel said he did and permit Jesus to be entombed. That's because earlier, Pilate got into hot water when he tried to place Roman standards bearing the images of the emperor in Jerusalem. This enraged the Jews because Jewish law forbids the making of divine images, and the Romans considered the emperors to be divine. Pilate nearly had a revolt on his hands. So it would have made sense that he wouldn't risk antagonizing the Jews again by leaving these 3 crucifixion victims on their crosses over Passover, which Jews would have seen as defiling the land. There would have been a riot at the exact time that Jerusalem was packed with pilgrims for the Passover, which is something that Pilate would have wanted to avoid. But what is the affirmative evidence that the tomb of Jesus was empty? Well, there are 3 lines of evidence that converge to make a strong case for the vacant tomb. First, there's what is known as the Jerusalem factor. Dr. William Lane Craig has popularized this argument, which basically says that the site of Jesus' tomb was known to Christians and non-Christians alike. If it were not empty, it would have been highly unlikely for a movement founded on the resurrection to explode into existence in the very same city where Jesus had been publicly executed just a few weeks before. That makes sense, doesn't it? As the renowned scholar C.F.D. Muley of Cambridge University put it, if the coming into existence of the Nazarenes, a phenomenon undeniably attested by the New Testament, rips a great hole in history, a hole the size and shape of resurrection, what does a secular historian propose to stop it up with? A second line of evidence for the empty tomb is based on what historians call the criterion of embarrassment. You see, one way historians try to determine if an ancient writer is telling the truth is by whether they include details that are embarrassing to themselves or which hurt their cause. In other words, why would you include an embarrassing fact unless it's true? If you felt the freedom to make up a lie, you'd never report something that damaged your own cause. Now, think about this. Who discovered the tomb to be empty? Women. Matthew 28 says, after the Sabbath, at dawn on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb. In verses 5 through 7, an angel tells them, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus, who was crucified. He is not here. He is risen, just as he said. Come and see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell the disciples, he has risen from the dead and is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him." Well, friends, here's the problem. In first century Jewish and Roman cultures, women were lowly esteemed and their testimony was considered questionable. In fact, they were generally not considered credible by men. They were in many cases not even allowed to testify in a court of law. How do we know? Well, the Jewish Talmud says, quote, "Any evidence which a woman gives is not valid to offer." Describing Roman culture, Josephus wrote, quote, "But let not the testimony of women be admitted, on account of the levity and boldness of their sex." The point is this. If you're going to make up a false story about the tomb being empty, there's no way you would say that women discovered that it was vacant. It would hurt your case among the very people you're trying to convince. In fact, Christianity was attacked by critics in the 2nd century who said, in effect, hey, you can't trust that story. They say women discovered the tomb empty. No, if the gospel writers felt the freedom to invent the story from whole cloth, they would have bolstered their case by saying a man discovered the tomb empty, maybe John or Peter. But they didn't. Why? Apparently because the truth of the matter is that women did discover the tomb empty, and the gospel writers were committed to telling what really happened, even if it was embarrassing to themselves. So the criterion of embarrassment tells historians that the report of the empty tomb is most likely true. The New Testament scholar I mentioned earlier, Dr. Craig A. Evans, said, "In my view, the tradition of women as the first discoverers is a strong piece of evidence in favor of the historicity of the empty tomb, if not the reality of the resurrection also." Now, the third line of evidence for the empty tomb is perhaps the most persuasive of all. It's called enemy attestation. In other words, what were the opponents of Jesus saying about the empty tomb? We know that when the disciples began proclaiming that Jesus had risen from the dead, what their opponents never said was, "Oh yeah? Go open the tomb and you'll see he's still in it." That's all they needed to say, and then the onus would have been on the disciples to prove it. But what did they actually say? We know from the Gospel of Matthew, as well as later accounts by Justin Martyr and Tertullian, that the enemies replied, "The disciples stole the body." Now think about that. What is that? It's a cover story. They're implicitly conceding that the tomb really is vacant, but they're trying to explain how it got vacant. It's like if you were a teacher and a student came up to you and said, "The dog ate my homework." That student would be admitting, "Look, I don't have my homework, but I can explain what happened to it. The dog ate it." Well, it's the same thing. So even the opponents of Jesus implicitly admitted that the tomb of Jesus was empty, which is a compelling piece of evidence that it really was vacant. So, really, everybody, implicitly or explicitly, is conceding that the body is gone. The real question, it turns out, is how did the tomb get empty? The Romans weren't about to steal the body. They wanted Jesus dead. The Jewish leaders of the day weren't about to steal the body. They wanted Jesus to stay dead. And certainly the disciples didn't steal the body. They didn't have the motive. They didn't have the means. They didn't have the opportunity. In fact, we have 7 ancient sources that the disciples lived lives of deprivation and suffering as a result of their proclamation that Jesus had risen. Those 7 sources are the book of Acts, Clement of Rome, Polycarp, Ignatius, Dionysius of Corinth, in a quote found in Eusebius, Tertullian, and Origen. While we don't have solid historical sources for how all of the disciples actually did die, we do have strong historical data that they were willing to die for their conviction that Jesus had risen from the dead. Friends, the affirmative evidence for the empty tomb is clear and it's convincing. And I don't think that any standard objection raised by critics is able to put the body back in the grave. Now, one objection raised by skeptics is that there are differences between the gospel accounts of the empty tomb, and therefore this casts doubt on their reliability. Let me give you an example. Matthew, Mark, and Luke say multiple women visited Jesus' tomb and discovered it empty. But John's gospel only mentions Mary Magdalene. But does that undermine their credibility? Well, not really. It seems likely that John is aware of the presence of other women, but he is simply focusing his attention on Mary. After all, it's not uncommon for ancient writers to spotlight one person among others. In fact, here's the thing. John reports Mary announcing to Peter and John, "They have taken the Lord from the tomb, and we don't know where they have laid him." Who's the we to whom Mary refers? Probably the other women who were also present. So there's really no problem here. What historians notice is that the differences between the gospel accounts are only in the secondary details. The core of the story is the same. Joseph of Arimathea has the body of Jesus put in his tomb. The tomb is visited by a small group of women followers of Jesus early on the Sunday morning following the crucifixion, and they find that the tomb is empty. They see a vision of angels saying that Jesus is risen. So we can have great confidence in this common core, even if there are some differences in the secondary details due to the different perspectives of the authors. I have to agree with Michael Grant, a usually skeptical historian who was a highly respected professor at Edinburgh University. He said this: "True, the discovery of the empty tomb is differently described by the various Gospels. But if we apply the same sort of criteria that we would apply to any other ancient literary sources, then the evidence is firm and plausible enough to necessitate the conclusion that the tomb was indeed found empty." Even so, we have to remember that an empty tomb does not a resurrection make. It's necessary to make the case that Jesus physically conquered the grave, but it's not sufficient. We need one more category of evidence to make the case for Easter, and we'll examine that the next time we get together. We can draw great comfort from the fact that Jesus conquered the grave, because it means that we will too if we follow him. At times when life seems fragile, that's a wonderful encouragement. One of America's greatest clergymen, George Whitefield, preached 18,000 times during the years that he lived in the 18th century. But out of all of his teachings, I have one favorite sentence. I thought of it several years ago when an unexpected medical crisis landed me in the hospital in critical condition. At times like that, we cling to the fact that Jesus isn't in his tomb, but he's alive. He's there to comfort and to encourage us. And if I were to close my eyes for the last time in this world, I knew I would open them in the next world and see my Savior face to face. Whitefield's words are these: "Thou mayest perhaps have a natural fear of dying. The body and the soul do not care to part without a little sympathy and a groan. But, oh, look yonder, look up to heaven, see there thy Jesus, thy Redeemer."